Is it okay with you to record it, Catherine? All right. Well, good morning, everybody, and good evening, Catherine. It's really nice to welcome all of you to this book launch of the Handbook of Diverse Economies, which is co-edited by Professor Katherine Gibson from Western Sydney University and Dr. Kelly Dombrowski from the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, who unfortunately cannot be with us today. Now, first of all, I want to thank Demet Dindler, who had the idea of inviting Professor Gibson when she and the Radical Theories in International Development reading group chose to discuss the Handbook of Diverse Economies. And to our great delight, Professor Gibson accepted and is joining us today from Australia, thanks to the magic of Zoom. Now, I'm personally really honored to be able to introduce Professor Gibson today. An article by Gibson Graham called Diverse Economies, Performative Practices for Other Worlds was a real eye-opener for me as to the potential of academics to become what the article calls subjects of possibility. And it has shaped my own thinking around creative teaching and research. I'm also assigning it in all my postgraduate classes. And I know that many of my students feel the same way about the vision that is laid out in the article. So it's also good to see so many students here today. It is the Diverse Economy Project, which aims to rethink economies as sites of ethical action, that Professor Gibson will talk about today. This project was developed over the last 40 years, and many of these years in collaboration with late Professor Julie Graham, which was really a kind of a groundbreaking collaboration that led to the joint ownership of Gibson Graham that many of you are familiar with, and that also showed us all the power of deeply collaborative work. Diverse Economies draws on political economy, feminism, post-structuralism, and action research to revolutionize economic geography, advancing critiques of capitalocentrism in books like The End of Capitalism as We Knew It, a feminist critique of political economy, which was first published in 1996. And then also alternative proposals that were put forward in books like A Post-Capitalist Politics, which was published 10 years later. But just as importantly, action research is a really crucial part of Professor Gibson's work, and projects like the Community Economies Collective and books such as Take Back the Economy, an ethical guide for transforming communities, are providing practical ideas and tools for both academics and activists interested in bringing economies, alternative economies, into being. Now, there's so much more I could talk about Professor Gibson's work, but I will stop here. A couple of practical points. The first part of the talk is structured around some general questions that came from the reading group that I will pose to Professor Gibson. And then we will have lots of times for questions from all of you afterwards. We'll go for about 90 minutes. Please type them in the chat when you think of them, and then we will either read them out or call on you in the second part of the talk to ask your questions. The talk is being recorded, as you all saw. Now over to you, Professor Graham. Thank you so much for being with us here today. And the first thing we would like to reflect on is kind of your own intellectual journey and the way you developed your early ideas on diverse economies with Julie Graham. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Anka, and also Demet for organising this setup. And hope you can hear me all fine. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. We've never really had a launch of the handbook because COVID hit just at the moment we were about to have a launch at the American Geographers Conference. So I think this is the first launch we've ever had. So thank you for organising it. And I'm very sorry Kelly wasn't able to be with us because she's it's 9:00 PM in New Zealand and she has quite small children, so it was just going to be impossible for her to be there. So thank you very much for organising this and inviting me to participate. And first, I just need to acknowledge, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Darug and Dharawal peoples, and here in southwest Sydney. I'm located on the banks of the Georges River, which you can see in the screenshot behind me. And I would like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. And this is something that in Australia we're still confronting, the whole issue of reconciliation with the colonial past of our country. However, let's move forward. And this is part of, I guess, the challenge of doing community economies work all over the world, is to deal with these kinds of past injustices. But to come to the question, I guess, that Anke has posed, how did Julie and I come to theorize diverse economies? I guess it came through a number of different challenges and concerns that we had. Initially, we were trained as, both as geographers, particularly me as an economic geographer, and Julie came out of a literature background, but we both started at graduate school at the time when Marxian political economy was really kind of sweeping into the social sciences and taking over critical radical theory. I mean, we were coming in after David Harvey had written Social Justice in the City, and people were becoming very concerned with the restructuring of capitalist industry all over the world and the changes that was bringing about. So we studied together Marxian political economy, and we were very interested in the idea that, you know, Marx had put forward, that we understand the world in order to change it. And we became pretty embedded in looking at theories of crisis and accumulation and falling rates of profit, and trying to explain why manufacturing industries were leaving one region and going to somewhere else, and finding cheap labor, and et cetera, et cetera. And we became part of a whole kind of cohort of people who were trying to understand what became known as the internationalization of capital, later became known as globalization. But as we became more and more skilled at trying to map out the changes that were taking place in the capitalist world economy, we became conscious that we were getting further and further away from thinking about how to transform this system, how to move to something different. And it was through that realization that more and more study of these kind of structural dynamics that Marxism exposed and that radical political economy was trying to unravel, wasn't exactly moving forward the project of trying to think outside or move beyond capitalism. And so we came to the conclusion that a kind of very hegemonic discourse of capitalism was stopping us from theorizing other worlds and other possibilities and other economies. So I guess we moved away from a kind of epistemology that was based in a kind of realist perspective, that we were really trying to uncover the workings of the system and get down to that radical roots that the kind of was often being, you know, proposed as what political economy was doing. We could see that there was a kind of a way in which, you know, this kind of discourse of capitalism that had sort of assumed the nature of this is the only kind of economy that's possible. Because remember, at this time in the late 70s, early 80s, the possibility of a socialist revolution had started to diminish. So there was no alternative to capitalism to some extent that was seen as viable. In fact, that more and more people had come to see that, you know, the capitalist economy was the model of what economies were. And we became very critical of that kind of idea, partly because of what it constrained in terms of politics. And it was at that point that I guess we started to think about all the other kinds of economic activities that maintain livelihoods that were not part of the economic vision or the orthodox economic vision of what an economy constituted, which was largely, commodity transactions, paid work, capitalist enterprises. And this kind of was the tip of an iceberg, as we saw it, under which there was a whole range of other forms of labor, forms of enterprise, types of transaction, kinds of property, and so on, that were predominant in the world, but were not featured in economic discourse. And of course, the feminist perspective that feminist economists were putting forward around the importance of unpaid labor, the way in which women's work was not accounted for in national accounts, etc., was very influential at this point. But so too was a kind of an anti-essentialist approach to Marxian theory that was being developed by the economists Steve Resnick and Rick Wolff at the University of Massachusetts, who'd been quite influenced by post-structuralist theorizing around the fact that identity wasn't set and stable. And their particular work has been involved in trying to look at class not as a category, as a static kind of category of identity, but class as a process. So they were interested in the multiple class processes that continue to coexist even with the rise of capitalist class processes. So this was one form of diversity that attracted us, that allowed us to start to see the naming of the economy as capitalism or capitalist as a kind of violence that was overwriting a range of other kinds of economic practices that were very important. So a combination of a kind of anti-essentialist critique of structural Marxism, a movement towards a different kind of epistemological engagement that accepted that there was multiple determinations, but as a theorist, one had some choice in terms of what kinds of realities one wants to make more real by one's theory, a kind of performative approach to theory influenced by post-structuralism and by feminism. These kinds of things contributed to the work that we started to do to map out diverse economies. And of course, also the work of economic anthropologists and informal economy scholars and so on, who are all studying all the different kinds of economic practices around the world. But these were always being kind of positioned as becoming capitalist or an opposite that was had to be subordinated to some extent. So we started to see how knowledge systems were positioning economic diversity in this kind of position of subordination that would never allow it to become a focus of a different kind of economy or a different kind of economic dynamism. And, you know, taking a kind of, taking a lead from the way in which feminists were seeing the way that the figure of woman was subordinated always to the masculine man position as the figure of the human, we started to kind of transpose that analysis into the way non-capitalist economic activities were always being positioned in a kind of subordinated role with respect to capitalist activities. And that kind of led us on to inventorying diverse economies and starting to talk to people as subjects of a diverse economy, because I think one of the elements of our action research was to work with people who saw themselves as no longer part of the capitalist economy. They were either unemployed or retrenched or had never had a role in it and didn't see themselves as economic subjects. And the diverse economy allowed us to start to talk to people as subjects who had made a contribution to people's well-being, which was then, therefore, they were a form of economic subject. And so there's a whole kind of role that the analysis of subjectivity has played in our work, and particularly in our action research. But perhaps I'll stop at that point, because there probably will be questions that I could unpack some of the things I've said at this point. You're still muted, Anka.
Just I want to say, a fantastic introduction into kind of how the concept of diverse economies came about, writing back against some of the theories of the time. So our second question is, from these beginnings, from my understanding, very much within human and economic geography, I mean, the concept has gone on to shape so many different fields, I think, in the social sciences and beyond, including kind of post-development, obviously, anthropology, feminist political economy. And could you reflect a little bit on kind of the power of the concept and its ability to shape debates in so many different academic fields?
Yeah, well, I think I probably don't even know where it's had its influence, you know, but I keep getting surprised by it. But I remember one of the comments that Donna Haraway made when she read The End of Capitalism, and we wanted her comment to be put on the cover, but for some reason it came too late. But she said when she read the book, she felt like some kind of iron brace had been released and she could start to breathe again. And I think what she was pointing to was something that a lot of people were feeling, that the kind of theory that they were embracing was becoming more and more constraining of creativity, of possibility, of being able to actually start where we are, to start to make a difference. And so I think that analysis resonated with people in a range of contexts. And really, I guess, this idea of capitalist centrism that we coined, this term that we took from feminism and deconstruction, from logocentrism and phallogocentrism, and moved it to the analysis of economics, this kind of capitalist centrism was really oppressing a lot of people in a lot of fields, both in terms of economic analysis, but also social analysis and place-based analyses, so such as anthropologists were doing and so on. It's also a kind of, I guess, the move towards thinking then about community economies and how we shift from a kind of a deconstruction and a reframing of the radical heterogeneity of the economic landscape. That's the first move, which is to kind of try to step outside of capitalist centrism and see this diversity. The next step, of course, is that kind of political step of starting to theorize the kinds of economies we'd like to strengthen, the kind of ethical economic practices that we would like to see more of. And that move towards theorizing community economies then, I guess, opened our work up to a lot of people who themselves were experimenting in trying to make different worlds. And so I think the activist interest in our work came through the community economies work, and a lot of artists have been attracted to our work on community economies because they themselves are experimenting, living on the edges of mainstream economies and so on, and trying to reframe worlds in the way that we were. So I guess that, the fact that we were working with both language, a politics of language, we were working with the politics of the subject, what kinds of subjects could start to construct new worlds. And they were also working with a politics of collective action, and what would be a kind of collective action that, yes, built on the insights of class struggle, but broadened it to a wider group of people than the kind of designated, agent of history, which was the traditional solitary worker, working class man. Once we'd sort of broadened that out, I think it opened up our work to people in a range of fields, as you've noted. And I guess, I guess there's certain areas, I think in economic geography, our work was quite derided for a long time, because I think the power of that political economic kind of analysis is still very strong in economic geography, but increasingly over time, people could, I guess, were drawn to the possibilities of taking a different kind of stance and loosening the kind of, the strictures of the strong theory that they're working with, to try and start to look for possibility, look for aligning themselves as theorists with experiments, and trying to not always show how experiments are going to be co-opted, but actually think about how you might strengthen these experiments as theorists and work alongside activists who are, building community currencies or experimenting with cooperatives, or trying to put caring work or the environmental stewardship at the centre of a local economic development plan, for instance. Yeah, so I guess the breadth of the work appealed across different fields, and it's sort of surprising in a way how it's been picked up. But I guess the other thing to say is that when we published Take Back the Economy, which was a book really directed towards a popular audience, the work then also took off around the world in different ways, because it got translated into a range of different languages where it was more accessible to a lot of different community groups and constituencies. So the Mandarin version of Take Back the Economy has now just come out, so to add it to the other ones, including a Finnish version, which was one of the more recent translations. I know we have some Finns in our audience.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I don't think it was surprising at all, the resonance that your work had. And as I said in my introduction, for me, your ideas around subjectivity, especially academic subjectivity. And I hope in the question and answers, we can talk a little bit more about weak versus strong theory. That's something that I think is really powerful. But since you mentioned books, let's move on to the Handbook of Diverse Economies. And if you could tell us a little bit about the story of the book. I think it's a great number of collaborators. So how that came together, your collaboration with Kelly, and also how the book in its diversity speaks to kind of the building of concrete alternative economies.
Yes, well, the book, I mean, it was interesting. I was invited to put together a handbook of diverse economies, and I kind of normally I look at handbooks and go, ugh. But I think they're very useful in teaching. and to be invited to put one together was a great honor, really. I guess it indicated to some extent that the field had got to a point where we could actually do such a thing as put together a handbook. And in fact, it was quite easy, really, because by the time this invitation came, we had established the Community Economies Research Network, which is really a network of scholars and practitioners across the world who are interested in community economies and diverse economies work. So early on, Julie and I had formed a collective of scholars who were largely our graduate students, and then as they became more senior, their own graduate students. So we had a small community economies collective, which operated for a number of years and still is the basis of our Community Economies Institute. And this is a group of scholars who often do research projects together, have written books together, and are generally trying to develop this theory, this work, this practice in a range of directions. But increasingly, we got a lot of people interested who wanted to be part of a network. And so we established the Community Economies Research Network, which is a much broader network of people who have got to know of our work through conferences or through classes or whatever. And it's a very open network. One only needs to know one or two people and ask for endorsement to get involved in it. But once the invitation to put the handbook together came out, I invited Kelly to work with me on editing the book, and we put an invitation out to the network to see who might be interested in contributing chapters. And we organised the book in terms of the kinds of, I guess, the elements of diversity that we'd used before in our work on enterprise and transactions and markets. But in Take Back the Economy, we'd also added property and finance. And so we decided to structure the book around diverse practices of those things: labour, enterprise, exchange, and property and finance. And we also decided to add in a whole section on subjectivity and also one on methodology. And we were delighted to see the range of chapter options that we were offered by members of the network. And so I think there's 66 authors and 58 chapters. So there's quite a few chapters that are collectively or written by one or two people. But yeah, so it's quite a hefty book, as you've probably seen. We invited some of the more senior members of the collective to write framing chapters for each of these areas to try and kind of document what the thinking is around such diverse practices of labour or questions of subjectivity, and kind of summarise the work that's been done, but also identify some of the kind of cutting edges that are happening in these fields, these areas. And so there's framing chapters that are longer chapters, and then I think 6,000 words. And then we invited people to write topic chapters that were only about 4,000 words, which I hope are very readable, because they're quite short, but they're quite readable pieces that are engaging and useful, I hope, for teaching. So this process took quite a while, of course, probably a few years, 2 years. We had a few workshops, particularly with the framing authors, and we had a few ongoing workshops with topic chapters, and did a lot of editing and work back and forth to kind of clarify and I guess, and increase the communicative value of this as much as we could. But in general, it was an absolute delight to work on. I didn't really find any of it arduous. It was a real pleasure to work with so many great authors and with Kelly to put the book together. And the framing authors also helped edit and give feedback to the chapters that were in their sections. So it was sort of had a devolved structure, but ultimately Kelly and I ended up, overseeing the whole process. And we had one of our wonderful artist members of the CERN and members of the CEI, the Community Economies Institute, Ailey Rutherford, allowed us to use one of her images that she's used when she's worked with community groups trying to map out their economies, that as the image that's on the front page of the cover of the book. So we're really happy with that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And it would be great to hear from the students of the reading group what you thought of the chapters. And I think that concludes our formal part. Thank you so much, Katherine, to giving us kind of this framing and your thinking behind both diverse economies and this handbook. And right, Demet, we can open up now to questions. Are there any in the chat yet? Let me just have a quick look.
No question on the chat board yet, so I think
I have, but I will see if there are any from the audience already. If I could just ask you, if at all possible, we usually invite people to turn their camera on for this more interactive part, if you're at all able. We understand that it might not be possible for some people, but it would be lovely to see. There's so many of you here to see you. And yeah, just kind of raise your hand or indicate. Lucilla, I think you're up first. Where are you? I just saw you. Lucilla.
Well, thank you. And thank you for this amazing talk. Actually, I have to admit I'm not that familiar with the diverse economies, but I've been teaching a lot on the political economy of the environment, and my feeling at the moment is that I am depressing my students by telling them how horrible everything is and then giving them a token, but there's alternatives at the end, right? So I'm wondering how I can use your ideas to think of revamping all my teaching so that, because it also comes from being Argentinian as well, that by studying Buenos Aires and Argentina, I was placed in development, right? But I never thought of myself as development because it's just my country. It's not developing, like it's just is. It's only if you think about it in terms of that systemic way of thinking. So those two things have, I've been thinking about those two things, and I wonder if you could maybe help me with my teaching. Think how can we do this differently, right?
Yeah. I think what you're pointing to is something that happens a lot, which is we come to our teaching or our writing with a real desire to be opening up space for possibility and spend all our time closing it down. And, so many courses do what you say, which is, you set out all the reasons why the capitalist system is terrible and it's done this and that and the other, and it's produced underdevelopment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then at the last class you say, and actually we need to get beyond this, but there's no tools that have been given then to the students to start to think otherwise. And I think this happens in so much writing as well, that we feel like we have to reveal the horrors or the structures that are constraining us and so on. And at the end we say, but there has to be a way forward. But all of our kind of intellectual effort has gone into describing the beast rather than trying to think about how do we make the beast less powerful, or think about the ways that there are other things going on at the same time. So I guess one option would be just to totally change it around and start to think about instances that are inspirational in terms of what is going on around questions of environment in Argentina or in Latin America or elsewhere, where, you know, communities are starting to reshape their agroecology, for instance, in the face of, you know, all the geoengineering and all this kind of work that, you know, obviously the food sovereignty movement is a very hopeful kind of movement. Where places are getting into environmental repair as a form of stewardship of environment, they may be getting payments for ecological services, and that might be seen as a very neoliberal thing, but they're actually also being employed perhaps in doing some kind of environmental reparative work that might fit with other kinds of values and cosmologies and so on. So, I mean, one could task oneself to look for all these moments where you could see some possibility, and perhaps in unpacking those, look at the challenges that are coming from agribusiness or from environmental degradation over generations, etc., as the backdrop, but focus first off on the practices that are kind of enlivening people, and organize a course around that. It's not to ignore the horrors, but to try and put forward the practices that are coming out of some kind of action or hopeful action. And some of them might be resistance ones too. I mean, there's lots of interesting forms of resistance going on, I think, all through the world. But yeah, I guess, so that would be one strategy for me, I would think of, looking at the diversity of collective action that's taking place in the field that you're interested in, and how it might match up, because it doesn't have to be just small scale. I mean, I think the issue around food sovereignty and so on is an interesting one. One of my graduate students is working on the committee for, what is it, food sovereignty in the UN at the FAO, and looking at how social movements are feeding into that process, because they've been allowed to be participants in this process, not just observers, like in the most of these kind of big international organizations. So, you know, one doesn't have to only look at what's happening at a local level. You could start to look at these kind of assemblages that produce connections across scale, because I think another thing that we're often confronted with doing this kind of work is that argument that, oh, this is just small and local and not going to affect the world, you know, it's not global and so on. And so I think we have to work against that to show the ubiquity of the kinds of practices that you might uncover. These things are not just happening in Argentina, they'll be happening in Cambodia or in India or elsewhere. And the fact that they're not networked at the moment doesn't mean that they can't be networked, or that they can't be seen as something that's actually at a global scale. And it's our challenge as theorists to actually re-theorize what a global scale of community economy activism might be, not to accept the fact that something that's small isn't global, you know. So I guess that would be one way I would have of approaching the challenge, but I recognize that it's a big one.
Thank you. That's brilliant.
Lucilla, I just want to add, there's actually a group of people in Global who are thinking precisely around those terms for teaching. So I'll be in touch with you and let you know. But great first question.
Great,
I think Mario is next, right, Demet? Yes, Mario.
Hi, Katherine. It's such a treat to have you speaking to us. And, you know, one of the benefits, I think, of this whole COVID crisis is that, you know, sometimes it's given us a bit of more of a chance to talk across borders. And I was very pleased, like 20 years ago, to be introduced to your work when I was at Bristol University by Adam Tickell, our Vice Chancellor, funnily enough, who has moved away from those radical ideas. But I think that one of the things that
it must have been in the last week of the course, was it?
One of the things that, you know, you've really, I think, inspired many of us is this ability to try to understand that we can live both inside and outside of capitalism, that we don't have to think of all our relationships as involving exchange and capital. And I wanted to ask a question around your relationship to Marxist research that I think is inspired by this. I'm thinking of the work of the open Marxism, Massimo De Angelis, and these kind of people. and the whole concept of commoning and that, because if I could kind of reflect a bit on the kind of difference, I think that there are lots of experiments out there, and often the middle classes and the elites can experiment because they have capital in order to invest in that. But ordinary working people and poor people often have to fight first to get the space in order to experiment. And therefore there is a process of struggle that creates the conditions under which new ideas can emerge. And for poor and marginalized communities, often that means the class struggle or the race struggle or the indigenous struggle, which creates those conditions. And, you know, what I'm thinking of is, for example, the struggles now in Rojava, struggles now going on as we speak in Colombia, of trying to create alternatives, but it really involves that kind of first moment of struggle to create the space in which then experiments can occur. And I kind of feel like there's part of the living outside of capitalism, which is sometimes a bit of a luxury, a bit like the kind of idea of the hippie commune, that you step out because you can. And then there are others that are just fighting for a space to breathe in order to create those conditions. And therefore, like I guess I'm trying to say is that, is there use in holding on to concepts of Marxism, concepts of class struggle, and combining them with the very open ideas of creating new lives, living inside and outside of capitalism?
Yeah, well, that's a really complex set of issues you've laid out there. And I guess my first reaction is to reject the whole inside-outside capitalism framing. Because I think what happened in our work is we ended up sidestepping the term capitalism because of the very way in which it sets up a container that has an inside and an outside. So I always focus on the term practice, capitalist practices or activities, rather than an ism, which starts to put things into a formation that then has a whole, an identity, or some sort of a formation from which you can see an inside and an outside. You know, and that is a very common kind of trope of Enlightenment thinking. We've been brought up with dualisms. That's the way our thinking works. It's A, not A. It's capitalism, not capitalism. And I think that is dangerous in a sense, because I think it poses some of these dichotomies in either or in an either or kind of framing. So to me, it's not helpful to talk about living inside or outside of capitalism. It's more helpful to talk about living in this, environment of radical heterogeneity in which there's some very powerful actors, some of which are capitalist corporations, others of which are forms of corrupt cabals that have got potentially nothing to do with capitalism, but are to do with the performance of a certain kind of greed, and we need to have fine-tuned analyses of what it is we're up against in some cases. So rather than put everything together into this box called capitalism and see all sorts of forms of corruption and rentier behavior, etc., as capitalism versus a kind of sense of economic violence that comes out of bare power, that's coming out of a whole lot of other histories and backgrounds and so on. So that's the kind of step towards a more weak theory approach, I suppose, that then allows me to say, well, yes, I think classic class struggle, classic working class struggle for better wages and better conditions is very useful and is very powerful and needs to be supported. That kind of vision that links that to then the only form of revolution, I think, is problematic, because I think it doesn't allow for the kinds of other forms of economic well-being that can be created outside of the wage-labor relationship, potentially around, increasing the possibility for caring labor to be put at the center of livelihoods and development and so on. But that the question of do we need wealth to have the space to be anti-capitalist, I think I guess I feel like I'd rather approach that as an empirical problem rather than a theoretical or political problem, because it does seem to me there's many cases in which people with very little still organize to, create alternatives. And you might think of something like the situation in Kerala, where people are very poor and yet they've been able to support a mass literacy for women project, science in the schools, and being able to kind of have a form of economic development that is is quite interesting in terms of at infant health, the development of different kinds of community-based cooperatives and so on. So there are cases in which poorest of the poor have been able to organize differently. Why it is in different situations that these kinds of things can't happen, I think is a question for analysis. I mean, you talked about Colombia. I haven't been up with the very latest that's happening there, but I did visit a few years ago and was able to work with some women who were, very exploited workers in the export flour industry on the plains of Bogota. And they were older women who were now no longer able to work in that industry because it's so debilitating physically. And they were wanting their daughters not to have to move into that industry. So they had started a school and were using Take Back the Economy, actually, because it was translated by Colombians into Spanish, as a way of inventorying their different forms of labor and well-being and trying to recenter a kind of community economy on agroecology and different kinds of economic enterprises. And of course, that experiment, has had all sorts of pitfalls. I mean, the land they had access to for a small communal farm was taken away by the local municipality. They've started another one. So they're always confronting the struggles with the aristocracy of the area, the kind of corrupt politicians of the area, et cetera, but they're continuing with this vision of a different kind of economy within that context. So I guess, I guess I look for examples always as counters to the very top-down analyses that emphasize the impossibilities and problems. But having said that, I think the work on commoning that's happening within the Marxist tradition and the kind of neo-Marxist tradition is very interesting, and I'm very much engaged with talking about different ways of thinking about commoning as a new kind of, in a way, it's a new political language that it relates to class, but it's beyond class, and I think it's quite a useful term for building alliances with people in terms of a new political formation.
Thank you. Mikko, you're next.
Thank you. I managed to get the voice and everything on. You can probably hear me okay.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you for the very inspiring talk, and I look forward to reading the handbook as soon as our library gets it.
It's terribly expensive, I'm sorry.
Yeah, but that's the usual case with academic books, so as expected. But I'm personally working on the role of alienation under capitalism. So this sort of really classic Marxist theory, in other words, which has largely fallen on the wayside and is relatively rarely discussed or considered nowadays. Most of the work that discusses alienation basically just seems to try to mitigate it under capitalism, like human resources literature and some organizational research and so on and so forth. But the way you described the book, that there was a lot of community work between academics, that got me thinking that community work in higher education might be something that could help against alienation, because as academics, we're also alienated because capitalism is more and more starting to dictate our terms of work. So I'm curious if diverse economies could work as a non-alienating pathway towards post-capitalist imaginaries?
Yeah, I think alienation is it's a very potent theory, I think, and I think it's still very relevant in so many ways. However, I guess the Marxist theory of alienation really places the kind of identifies the alienated subject with the working man or the working class subject who's alienated from the products of their labor and so on. So if we then use a more post-structuralist lens and look at the multiple subject positions that we occupy, the way in which the subject is decentered, then I guess what does that do for a theory of alienation is the question. Are there ways that we can, obviously, people have used theories of oppression and especially feminists have used the notion of oppression as a kind of form of patriarchal alienation or a version of that kind of thing. But there's also then, I guess, the other kinds of psychosocial kind of positionalities that come from a range of subject positions that one occupies in life, whether it's as a family member or a mother or a carer or a volunteer or a gift giver or whatever. So when I think about the academic subject, yes, we are increasingly subjected to a kind of neoliberal regime of accountability and performance that's certainly coming out of a kind of managerial way of behaving that has been very instrumental in capitalist business, and in many ways you could argue is a sort of a form of capitalism inserting itself within academia. But we also do have other subject positions within academia, and I think as colleagues there is a kind of collegiality, a communality that has been part of our tradition. The idea of mentorship, the idea of collaboration and so on is still, at least I think we need to fight for that as part of what being an academic subject is. And I think that, that there has to be some kind of recognition that we do have some kind of we do have some freedoms within academia. I was saying this to someone yesterday. I mean, the fact that we can do this as part of our work, this kind of exchange, this kind of knowledge exchange, we are to some extent, those of us who are paid, and I know that precarity is a big issue, but we are paid to read, to think, to talk, to teach, is still something that engenders a particular kind of generous subjectivity, I think it should anyway, that is part and parcel of our multiple subject positions as academics, alongside of the kind of alienated vision of how many publications in which Q1 journals, etc., how much money are you bringing in, all this kind of stuff. So I guess if we take it out of the academia, then I think it's still important to hang on to the ways in which alienation dominates many people's lives, and particularly those who are in certain kinds of occupations, ones particularly who might be threatened by the changes that are occurring around automation, or the changes that might be occurring around renewable industries. For instance, in Australia, the coal miners are still very arrogant and angry about any kind of policy that moves towards addressing climate change. And this comes out of a form of alienation in a sense. Then it's very important to understand that in order to try to address and talk to people. But I guess the strategies that I've used in the kind of action research I've done has been to take that sense that we are multiply inserted into our social formation, and therefore the alienated self is one of the many selves we occupy. And so that, I guess, is a way of thinking with and around that theory, which has been so generative, I think, in terms of a kind of more psychoanalytic understanding of the subject. I don't want to lose that, what Marxism has brought to our understanding of the self, but I don't want to be constrained totally by that as an insurmountable kind of challenge to moving forward, you know. But I think the question of alienation is something that needs to be updated these days, really, and it's something that my colleague Stephen Healy is very interested in, trying to use, I guess, a more psychoanalytic approach to politics within the community economies kind of work.
Thank you. I think we have next Andy and then Hannah. Andy.
Hi. Hello, Katherine. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah. Good. Okay, so you've partially answered my question already, but so I'm trying to write a dissertation about a community garden that I'm involved with just down the road, using diverse economies research as a kind of a lens. And my supervisor has stressed that he suggested that he wants me to look at tensions between what I find and capitalism. And I kind of thought that this was a pretty typical thing of him to say. And in a sense, I mean, he hasn't read your work at the moment, but I sort of wanted to avoid the trap of going down this kind of pitching things as opposite binaries kind of fighting against each other, because I don't think that's always how it happens. I think often, to some extent, they can be complementary. Sometimes they're passing over each other without too much interaction, and so on. But you know, I don't want to necessarily waste a huge chunk of my dissertation going down the same route that most people would in this kind of discipline. You know, I'm trying to bring out the utopianism of what goes on, you know, rather than, you know, as Lucilla earlier sort of pointed out, you know, we need hope, sort of thing. And I suppose one particular example with this is the need for grant funding to operate this project, which is kind of like a catch-22. It's like, you know, they need the grant money in order to fulfill the conditions to get the grant money. You know, to become a lot of the volunteers are adults with learning difficulties, so they expect a certain kind of, or their carers expect a certain sort of standard of you know, provision, and you know, they want the place to be there still. If they run it purely as an anarchist kind of collective, very soon it's going to be they're going to get evicted from local authority land or whatever. So it's kind of, there's a bit of a trap there. But yeah, so I suppose it's about you know, there will be some tensions between capitalism and non-capitalism. At the same time, it's not always about tension, you know. Can you expand on that maybe a bit? I don't.
Yeah, that's a great kind of case in a way, because I think, you know, if it would be good for you to kind of identify what are the things that your supervisor would see as capitalism in this case. And what you've identified is the funding, financial flows, potentially the property ownership or the rights to the land. So, and I don't know whether there'd be other things like the labor relations of the site or something like that. But so my suggestion would be to identify what exactly is being referred to when he or she asks you to look at the conflicts with capitalism. And I would get below that term to the actual things. And so, which is like kind of a diverse economies approach, really, to say, well, you know, financing is always an issue around these kinds of community issues, access to land and the continued access or protection of access to that land. Or in other words, is that land actually common for by this community of people or not? What extent is it or not? I guess there would be kind of municipal rules and regulations which we could classify as capitalist, but why do we need to? We could just see them as municipal rules and regulations, you know. And then there's the whole operations of the activity itself. So I guess I would be interested in looking at, you know, the micro politics around some of those things and the possibilities that have emerged for the groups that are using the community garden. You might be interested in a piece that I've written with a few others around a kind of a community garden, an agrocité in Paris called Urban, which was built or started by an activist architecture group, Doina Petrescu and Constantin. I can send you the reference if you like, or we could put it in the chat. But we've done an article about the value of commoning. And because this project was set up with EU funding, and it was supposed to run for 10 years, and it was both an urban agriculture and agro-city kind of eco-education centre with a recycling centre and social housing, all kind of within 5 kilometres of each other. The two of the things got built, but the third one didn't. And then the local council ended up changing its complexion from progressive to right wing, and they stopped the whole project, but not before data had been collected for a number of years, but particularly 1 year, on all the volunteer labour that had taken place, all the value of the vegetables that had been produced, the kind of ecological services that had been developed, et cetera, et cetera. So we started to actually document in monetary terms the value that had been created on this block of land, as a way of looking at kind of transition towards a one ecological footprint situation for a city. And the input investment was this EU money, but what was generated from that investment, both in terms of the actual returns of some of the small enterprises that were developed, like a worm farm and other things on the property, but also the value of the food, the value of the training and capacity building that took place, the value of the volunteering, et cetera, far outweighed the amount that had been put in terms of a kind of return on investment. We use this idea of a community economy, return on investment. So this was kind of trying to use, you know, capitalist accounting, if you want to call it that, but just got to say business accounting methods to try and actually map the value of commoning and what it was creating as a way of arguing for the need for transitional processes to kind of, you know, move cities along kind of in an ecological sense. And that's, you know, it's not denying the fact that there was ultimately brute force that was exacted by the mayor, whose husband happened to be a property developer and wanted that site for a car park, you know, and whether that's capitalism or whether that's just, you know, family greed, I don't know what you could call it. But the fact that happened is alongside the fact that this other value was created. And as it's turned out, the Urban experiment has now been replicated in 3 or 4 other places within Paris because it was shown to work. So, you know, I think there's a kind of lot of nuance here, and we can use the tools that we have to try and demonstrate value in a different way, to speak back to that dominant sense that capitalism rules, or that the capitalist accounting system rules, or that the property developers rule, or whatever. So I guess I'd encourage you to kind of, you know, look to the fine tuning and look to the ways in which we might account for what's actually occurring there. And, you know, that kind of intervention is a way of then leveraging further value, further grants. But if you can show that a particular grant will unleash this other value, which is both monetary and non-monetary, but we can monetarize it just for the sake of argument, then I think you've got more power to get that grant money, because it fits within a wider agenda about greening the city, about transitional, you know, how do we transition to a more ecological sense of a city, etc., alongside the kind of issue around giving people meaningful employment and purposeful work and etc. And one of the things that was most important about that site was the fact that it was a site that people could come together and learn from each other. The fact that they were doing gardening was one thing, but it was the fact the peer-to-peer learning that they were getting from being together was the most important thing, or one of the most important things. And that had to be valued as well, because, you know, that's something that works against alienation. It works against mental illness, you know, it worked against crime and so on. So I think, you know, we can kind of flesh out all these values and try and talk back to that kind of vision of struggle with the system, you know.
Mm. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Cheers.
Thank you, Katherine. There's some really practical tips for students as well in terms of how to think of, you know, framing dissertations. It's brilliant. So we have Hannah, Christiana, Maria, and Cassidy next. So Hannah, over to you.
Hi, Katherine. Thank you for joining us today. I've been fortunate enough to read a couple of chapters from the book already with the reading group. And I just had a question. As a student, how do you propose that we bring some of these discussions into our everyday lives with non-academics?
What can you give me more of an idea of who you're thinking of and who you're working with or you'd like to work with?
I think a lot of the ideas in the book are really great, and particularly thinking back to the Labour chapter. I think that to not just get ideas from academics is really important as well. And as sort of a starting point in your everyday life, how would you suggest we prompt these discussions, as a lot of them are obviously very politically orientated? And would you suggest this is something that we can just have as sort of like a dinner time conversation and work from there? Or do you believe this is something that needs to be done on a larger scale to really incite change?
Well, yeah, I guess I think it can happen in both ways, but I guess that I guess I'd be interested in you looking at Take Back the Economy, because that is more oriented towards working with people in the community, or you know, a reading group or a church group or something like that, where you might say, well, are we interested in looking at what we can do together? The first step we suggest is to do this inventory, to start doing this inventory of all the different kinds of work we do, the kinds of, and classify them in terms of the, you know, whether it's paid, unpaid, volunteer, gifting, whatever, or the different kinds of enterprises we're involved in, etc. I mean, I guess the Take Back the Economy has more steps for how you might take this conversation out into community work or working with a small group and so on. So I'd suggest perhaps looking at that as a way forward. This book is more of an academic book, I think, the Diverse Economies Handbook. So it's not a how-to in any way, whereas the Take Back the Economy book is a lot more of a kind of a how-to. And I guess, you know, it is an exploration, that kind of conversation. It's because, you know, one needs to kind of enroll others in the process of thinking about, do we want to go forward and try and do something differently? You know, are we disgruntled with the way things are here? Are we interested in doing something, making something, or agitating for something differently? And I guess it really depends on the context in terms of how you might activate some of this work. But I'd be interested to ask you how you found reading some of the chapters, and what feedback do you have for me on how they were written and the length of them, for instance.
Hannah, do you just want to share some of your impressions?
We had a lot of fruitful discussions in our reading group. It was difficult to say goodbye on the Zoom because I think we all wanted to talk for a lot longer about it. And I think a lot of us found it really accessible. We liked the framing chapter as sort of the introduction before it went into the discussion, and we each picked up several different elements that we found resonated with either things that we've studied or our dissertation topics. So more reading to be done, but we definitely enjoyed it. Thank you.
Great to hear. Thanks.
Brilliant. Christina.
Thank you. Yeah, I was hoping to pick your brains a bit as well on my dissertation topic, which is I'm studying climate reality, which is a social movement. I don't know if you're aware of it, that's been promoted by Al Gore in the US, and then it's sort of translated over, and there's a movement in the UK at the moment. I don't know if it's in Australia. But it's the sort of dichotomy, I think, of Al Gore, who is promoting sort of sustainable capitalism, and he's got a big investment bank which is investing in green technologies and using capitalism as a vehicle. And potentially, whether is that a green grab, is that still maintaining and promoting the capitalist system, and then the way that sort of feeds in and reflects into climate reality, which there's a possibility that there's more of a kind of performative angle to climate reality than actually, so they talk a lot about the issues, but not so much about calls to action. And I was just wondering if I could pick your brains on how to kind of navigate all of that. So
just, can you give me a bit more background? Is climate reality what Al Gore's arguing? Is that his movement? Yes,
yeah. He's kind of set up a really big, and Al Gore, has brought the attention to a lot of people all over the world about the climate issues for decades. He's kind of, so.
I witnessed one of his big presentations.
Yeah.
He came here, yeah.
But at the same time, he's very much part of the capitalist machine, and so he doesn't reject capitalism, but rejects the devastation of the planet. So it's the way he's kind of evangelized the social movement. And my feeling is that there's a lot of discussion about the terrible things, but there's no radical reaction or call to action from it. And it's just whether you've got any thoughts of how to navigate that.
Well, I mean, he's obviously, is he trying to call capitalists to action, do you think?
No, so he's got a big investment bank which funds a lot of green projects, but I'm wondering how much of that is part of like a green grab, in terms of in the way the corporates, BP is now investing in BECCS technology or carbon capture technology, and in order to still be in existence, and to stop the kind of death spiral of the big corporations, they're now investing into green tech. So it's just a very difficult thing to navigate, and I just wonder.
I think it is. It is. I don't think we're going to deal with the climate crisis unless we have some capitalist corporations actually doing stuff too. So I guess I'd be interested to not necessarily put this in the box of the capitalist machine. He's got an investment bank. It's trying to invest in green technologies, and many capitalist corporations have seen this as a great money spinner and are getting into green technologies. And some of them are getting into the horrible kind of weird experiments of geoengineering and so on that I think are very potentially problematic. So I guess I'm interested in a world in which there are ethical practices being undertaken by a range of different actors, and some of those actors could well be capitalist corporations, but not all capitalist corporations have a lot of ethical practices associated with them. I mean, and some of them change. Some of them are very unethical and then suddenly see the light or get taken to court or whatever, or their CEOs change and they do change. So I feel like there needs to be a sense of economic diversity relates to capitalist enterprises as well as it does to non-capitalist enterprises, and we need to be able to discern which capitalist enterprises are operating in ways that we would see as having ethical outcomes. And that's going to change. We need to be very able to be kind of nimble in terms of that analysis. But I don't discount the fact that there can be capitalist corporations doing something that might be good for the planet. And just recently, I was involved in a research project in Australia on manufacturers, and we interviewed a range of manufacturing corporations, companies, including capitalist international corporations, family businesses that would be seen as capitalists, but they were kind of many generations hence. They were kind of really more family businesses than anything else. Social enterprises and cooperatives, and we were trying to look for ones that were operationalizing a form of just sustainability. So ones that were providing good jobs for people with good trajectories, but also involved in environmental care and repair. And you know, some of those companies were capitalist corporations. One of them is very well known, Interface Carpets. It makes modular carpets, but it's led by the CEO many years ago read Paul Hawkins' The Ecology of Commerce and totally changed his perspective and moved towards a carbon neutral kind of form of carpet manufacturing. So, you know, one could have a very cynical, this is just greenwashing, or you can actually look at what they've done, which is amazing investment in changing their technologies and moving now towards trying to operationalize the idea that the factory should be able to produce the same amount of ecological services in its footprint as a forest in the area that it's located. Now, these are challenges the company has set itself that it doesn't know how to meet, but it aims towards doing it because of this commitment to sustainability. And you know, there were other companies, the family businesses that were also very interested in, you know, making mattresses that could be totally recycled, and were pairing up with social enterprises that were doing the kind of deconstruction of those mattresses and generating jobs for a lot of people who were retrenched and unemployed in the social enterprise, but tied into a more high-tech form of production. So, you know, this is a more fine-tuned analysis that says there's businesses and there's businesses, and there's banks and there's banks, and we need to look at what they're actually doing before we make the judgment that they're part of the capitalist industrial complex or machine that is ruining the world. I mean, yeah. So I think my intuition would be to step down a level of abstraction into the detail. And Al Gore is an ally in so many ways, I think, in terms of putting the issue of climate change on the agenda. You know, he's a big man and he's definitely funded by major corporations. And we need to keep those corporations that do say they're doing something for the planet, we need to keep them to account and just keep revealing when they are and when they aren't. But it does seem to me we do need the power of some of those large corporations to be on side if we're ever going to address the magnitude of the issues we've got here. At the same time, I'd like to argue for more democratized ownership of companies, and, you know, the divestment of those companies into employee ownership or cooperatives and other things. So I think we have to work on a number of fronts, but having the kind of analysis that anything that's corporate is already going to be greenwashing is just not an analysis. It's closing the door on analysis before we begin. So I think it's up to us to kind of open up that possibility that and argue with the companies for that possibility that they can be leaders in ethical economic practice and not be exploitative of the environment or of people. Yeah, so I guess that would be my advice to you and your project.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think that's really useful advice for all of us. Maria, where are you?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for this time. I have a question. Sorry if it is a little sensitive. I'm quite sensitive right now. I'm sorry. I love in your book, one of your paragraphs when you say that we cannot remake the world easily without significant resistance. And we can choose to create new discourses and counter technologies of economy and construct strategic forms of interplay solidarity, bringing to the fore ways to make other worlds possible. And then you say that's difference, that makes that difference visible. That's not automatically produce new ways forward, but it can generate new possibilities and different strategies. And to be honest, that inspired me a lot. And actually, I had to write it down on my board to remind myself of it every day. But what happens when neither the old speeches nor the new speeches are heard by a government or the private sector? Sorry.
Yeah.
What happens when resistance seems like an act of privilege because people cannot resist but survive? For example, at this time, in Colombia, yesterday, the government stopped the process of vaccines against COVID in those cities that remain active on the streets. And that's not new. This has been happening for 50 years. So what should we do? Like, everything seems a little black and blur right now.
Yeah, I really hear you, Maria. I think it's a hard time to be feeling up or hopeful at the moment. And I guess what seems so clear is the governments that that have failed, particularly through this COVID experience, and there's a similarity between them. They're very right-wing and patriarchal and ignoring the voices of people in so many ways. And it's extremely oppressive in those environments. I don't know that I have anything, any kind of way to counter that. I think we have to stay with the grief and the recognition that there are these really horrendous kind of decisions of public policy that are being made by people who have actually been voted into power. So it's such a conundrum to me that there's still such strong support for people who are clearly not looking after the public good. And that, I guess, that is an issue. It comes back to those questions, that maybe the question of alienation that was raised earlier. How is it that electoral politics is allowing people to vote people in who are so working against their own interests, the interests of the common people and so on? It's I think there are forces at work here around other I guess ways of swaying people that obviously economic insecurity and so on is a big issue in many countries, and why these strong leaders can be getting power is to do with manipulating people who are economically insecure, but and then playing off various issues around religion and other kinds of questions of identity. I think all we can do as scholars and activists is to try and I guess do the work of showing these connections and unraveling these connections without building them into a structure. Because I think as soon as we start building them into a structure, then they start to defeat us. I think there's the overdetermined aspects of each of these situations where multiple influences have come together to create a situation where these kinds of horrendous practices are taking place. And I guess partly what we can do is share the grief and support each other in that grieving. Partly we need to bring our intellect to looking at these connections and figuring out where it is that the power lies to sway people in certain directions. What is that power? And I don't know that it helps to say capitalism's doing this. It just doesn't seem to help And we've been saying that for 200 years now, and it doesn't seem to have helped that much, you know. So we need some way of unraveling and unpacking this, and I guess figuring out, ways that people can support each other, how to deal with the vaccine questions. You know, it just seems to me the whole way in which right-wing governments are overseeing the death of their populace is just horrendous. And obviously it's changed around a bit in places like the US, where there was a sudden change of government, changed around a little bit in the UK with the kind of vaccine rollout. But really, there's been such an alignment of a certain kind of right-wing power at a governmental level and the disasters that are occurring. And I think we need to expose that and try and figure out how we can start to influence not just electoral politics, but just the groundswell of outrage around this. I mean, India at the moment, I think, is a case in point where there's just a sense of outrage, and I hope that that really has some impact at a higher level. But I feel a little bit inadequate to really answer your question, and I guess I'd be interested in other people pitching in and seeing what they think at this point.
Thank you so much.
If anybody else wants to speak to that, we have one last question in the queue, which is Cassidy's. I'm also realizing it is getting rather late in Australia. So, but is there anybody who has any thoughts on what Katherine just said, or any ideas for Maria or the situation in Colombia? I think Mario just left. He probably would have been well placed to speak to that.
Mm.
Well, how about I'll hand it over to Cassidy for your question, and then we'll see if there's any comments at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Well, I'm kind of going to take what Maria and Hannah asked and like kind of recraft a new question. So like, as I was reading the handbook, my first thought was, one, the layout was fantastic, by the way, to go back to your initial question. And the word count, like for the 4,000 to 6,000 was perfect range, because it was like easily digestible, like small targets. But as I was reading it and going through like the breakdown, it kind of felt like you and, you know, all the other writers like overturned all of these stones, like made these connections in ways that like, you know, I'm new to this field and I like thought, wow, like they really got everything covered. It really felt like the basic connections between people in institutions, people in commodities, and the way that we engage in the relationship that we have with the world around us, and being able to take it out of like the binary of like capitalism and, you know, non-capitalist like interactions, and say, you know what, we're going to trash that. We're going to move forward. We're going to say like capitalist practices. And I thought that that was very helpful in kind of removing us from this set box. But, you know, as I was like reading it and thinking about how like, where are the gaps, you know, like you're always taught like, where are the holes, like to look for it. And I was thinking, I grew up in like a very conservative area in the United States where what Hannah was saying is, how do you engage with this like at a dinner table and have these conversations? And, you know, like I thought, like, as I was reading this, how could I engage my family with this? How can I engage my community back home to see life outside of capitalist practices, to kind of reorient our view to be people-centric, but to also think about like collective action in a way that's not just about like what people back home might view as like the radicals or like the left just trying to be progressive for progressive's sake. But then to also like think about what Maria's saying is like, you have this fundamental wall, this barrier that like you're encountering, this resistance that like, you know, you can only keep going so long before like at the end of the day, like, how do we say, you know what, like these little packages and parcels that you have within the handbook of how do we initiate and engage and think about diverse economies and actually institute them in ways that are meaningful, like not just conceptually, but practically. And I think that like the conversation today did so much justice to like that mindset for me, and saying how like, you know, we have these aspirations, we have these goals, but as like young students, like how do, like for me in particular, how do I take this back home to, you know, my family and say, this is what the future is like heading towards, like this is an option, we can do this, it is viable, there are examples, like there are actual like lived like people who've like lived the experiment, if you would. But I think that at the end of the day, it's like, my big question is, what are, now that you have put together this handbook, the biggest barriers to diverse economies? Because it did seem pretty holistic, the handbook, but you know, I think you can say it's one barrier. You know, in my life, for instance, in talking about diverse economies, I think it's mentality, you know, people's willingness to like hold on to what's comfortable, and how what they're used to is what they expect other people to be used to as well, which is how the status quo is so pervasive and it's kind of hard to tear down. I would just like to see what, after years of dealing with community economies and the idea of diverse economies, what you think are going to be the biggest impediments to overhauling capitalist practices and the mentality that it allows.
Yeah, thanks, Cassidy. You know, one of the kind of little sayings that we always had was, we start where we are and with what we have. And partly that meant that in our action research, we worked with contexts or people where there was a sense in which there was something troubling that people wanted to deal with. So starting with, and then starting with what people have got, assets and so on that they can build on to start to move forward, was one of the kind of methods that we've used. But I'm just thinking about the situation you're referring to in your hometown or home situation, where it sounds like there's a lot of comfort and at least satisfaction with a particular status quo. But I wonder whether there are not also, you know, areas of concern, or what they might be. And because I think, you know, you can't just waltz in with a different worldview, or with a kind of, that's partly what the old revolutionaries tried to do. They'd walk in and say, you know, we've got the answer for you. You need revolution, and this is what it should be. And some people got on that project and others didn't. But, you know, these kinds of social transformation can't be top down. It has to come from some desire to have some transformation. And the question is, what can one appeal to for the self-satisfied suburban Australian or American or whatever, who is basically at the top of the chain? You know, they're the people for whom environmental degradation has worked well. They're the people that for whom, you know, all the kind of exploitation of past generations has fed to, or expropriation of land, for instance, in my case. How do we appeal to the most self-satisfied people in the world to say there needs to be some change? I haven't got the answer to that, but I know that, you know, when people have their houses flooded, or when they have to sit through 3 weeks of bushfire smoke in their wealthy area, or I guess in the case of in India at the moment, where the uber rich can't even buy their oxygen, there's a kind of sense in which there's a problem. And identifying those moments where the kind of security, the bubble that one lives in is somehow shaken, is the kind of place to start working, I think, in having these conversations. Unless there's some sort of interest in shifting, or some concern that what we've got at the moment is problematic, it's very hard to know how to move forward, I think. And so partly I've always done work in places where there's a clear sense, like somewhere like Colombia or somewhere like the Philippines or in a deindustrializing region in Australia, where there is a sense that there's an issue that needs to be dealt with here. But the challenge is, I think the real challenge is, how do we work with not just the 1%, but the kind of 50%, well, I don't know what percent it is, but maybe the 30% of middle classes, people in the world who feel like they've still benefited from the Anthropocene, as opposed to realizing that their kind of lifestyle is what's killing us all. You know, how do we start working with that group of people? And clearly, you know, Al Gore's talks don't appeal to everybody. Showing that, you know, the extinction of species, David Attenborough's stories don't appeal to everybody. But what does appeal? I don't know. I mean, I think, but that's kind of the challenge, I think, for those of us working in very privileged environments, to say, how do we start to get people on side? And clearly there are people that are concerned about climate change, about inequality, about, you know, refugees and asylum seekers and so on. And these are the people that we can have these conversations with, in terms of thinking about how do we start to move forward and build different worlds. But how to deal with that satisfied, you know, bubble group, I don't know. And that's going to be your challenge, Cassidy, because unfortunately, you know, they are what's standing in the way of us really addressing some of the big issues of the world at the moment. Those who have, you know, those who have really are who are standing in the way, and how to appeal to them in a way that's humane, I guess, is, yeah, I think it's a real challenge. And it's a sort of thing that drives me to despair when I think of what Maria mentioned. I mean, each of us in our own contexts have situations, I think, that create huge despair. And at the same time, I feel, you know, I can't afford to submit to that. I have my own intellectual resources and a history that helps me start to think around things and produce some kind of hopeful way forward, even if, you know, when you look at the scheme of things, it's still quite small.
Yeah, what you just said about desire kind of struck through, like finding the small ways in which people desire a better world, and how those desires will be different in various communities across the world and for different reasons, and how it's about finding those things that could make their life more better, like just a little bit better, that we can target to kind of, like you said, introduce this new worldview, this diverse economy, and present it in a meaningful way.
Yeah. Let me know how you go.
I think that's such a powerful and really thought-provoking, I think, end to our discussion. And first of all, I would like to thank the students for engaging with the handbook and for giving your feedback and for asking really interesting questions. I think it really, you know, gave the talk a particular resonance. But Katherine, to you, as I said, your work has been hugely influential on my own thinking about being an academic and being an academic subject of possibility. And I really like that in your talk today, you actually showed us how to practice diverse thinking. For example, you know, seeing that, you know, not rejecting all capitalist corporations outright, but actually looking what is being done. But also giving some really practical tips to students and to all of us for how to think some of these really big questions through, and to not give in to despair. But I think we've heard hope is important. And I think how we can teach, we at Sussex or in Global, we think of it as critical hope, how we can bring that in our classrooms, into our research and into our collaborations. I think your work has been such a kind of a guide in all of that. So thank you. And thank you for talking to us today. It's been absolutely fantastic having you. And we hope at some point in the future, maybe even in person, it would be just really nice to be able to welcome you at Sussex. But thank you for your time today.
That's okay. Thank you. If I had my proper hand, I'd give a proper clap, but I haven't broken
clapping.
And good luck with all your projects. I think they sound fantastic, and it sounds like there's going to be some wonderful PhDs finished, and love to keep in touch with some of you. So yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk to you. It's been really really nice to explore your ideas and also to see that the book is helpful in the work that you're doing. I'll let Kelly know. She'll be thrilled too. Thanks very much. And now I'm going to have some dinner and a nice glass of wine.
Please do, please do.
Okay.
Fantastic. Have a lovely evening. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you
nice
so much. Enjoy your evening.
And we'll continue the conversation.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.